What would you do if you found a corpse without fingerprints? Sounds impossible, right? Well, it happened to me, and what seemed like a routine case turned into a nightmare full of secrets that no one wanted to see the light of day. I'm Esteban Morales, a forensic doctor in Mexico City, and this is a story of my most incredible case, the fingerprint that didn't exist. A man without identification arrived at the morgue, and as always, my job was clear. Look for fingerprints, clues, anything that would help us know who he was. But there was nothing, not a single fingerprint on his fingers. It was as if he had never lived, you know? No documents, no traces, no record at all. Something didn't add up. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. When something like this happens, the first thing we think is that it might be an error, some contamination, or a problem with the equipment. But the reality was much stranger. We searched all the databases, compared prints, anything, nothing. It was as if he had been erased from the system. I remember I started wondering if that was even possible. I thought maybe he was someone who never had official papers, someone invisible to the state. But we still had no clues, not a single fingerprint. How can that happen? Forensic science has very clear protocols, and this was one of those uncommon cases where you don't quite know how to proceed. As the investigation progressed, I began to examine other parts of the body looking for signs. Scars, tattoos, particular marks, not even that. Nothing, no name, no visible past. Just a man no one could identify. What I didn't know at that moment was that this unknown was not an ordinary mystery, but someone who had been erased on purpose. Someone who had lived in the shadows and who, by greater design, had had his identity eliminated. Why? That was the question burning in my mind. Months later, an insignificant clue changed everything. A tiny detail that no one would have noticed, and that led me straight to a group of people who didn't want that man to exist again. I realized there was something much darker behind the absence of fingerprints. Unintentionally, without looking for it, I had begun to return the identity to someone they believed dead even in memory. Because sometimes, erasing fingerprints is neither accident nor error. It's a conscious attempt to make an uncomfortable truth disappear. I'm going to tell you every step, every obstacle, and how a single fingerprint that didn't exist almost became the key to solving something no one expected. This case taught me that identity is much more than a name or a record. It's memory, presence, and above all, justice. Do you want to know how I ended up unmasking that silent conspiracy? Stay until the end, because this story goes beyond the simple work of a forensic doctor. This is about recognizing someone you thought forgotten and understanding the power of a fingerprint. Even when it seems like there isn't one, I only want the content of the text translated. Without any explanation or indication, we received that body in the forensic medicine department on a Tuesday afternoon. It had arrived like so many others, without identification, without documents, without clues. The usual in a city as big as Mexico City, where people disappear and reappear in ways that even statistics fail to capture. But from the beginning, something was different. When we meticulously cleaned the fingers to scan the fingerprints, there was no result. We checked several times with different equipment, with alternate technicians and experts. We even thought that perhaps someone had left a finger too stained or injured. But no, it wasn't there. There wasn't a single valid record, neither in the national database, nor in any international database, nor in the most advanced systems connected to Interpol. It was as if that man had never left a trace in history, neither physical nor digital. At first, I thought it might be a technical error. The day and night passed, and I stayed reviewing the data while my colleague looked at me with a frown. "It's strange," he said. "He has no criminal record, no complaints, no files. No one claims him, and no one is looking for him." Our eyes reflected the confusion we felt. But then I began thinking about something deeper. If he had no fingerprints, if he didn't exist in any databases, that man had managed to go through life without leaving a trace. How was that possible? I then decided to go beyond protocol. I spoke with police officers and prosecutors who had seen him in the early hours, and between small questions and big details, I began to understand that this body, although young, had some connection to the clandestine world. But in that underworld, amid noise and corruption, He disappeared as quickly as he appeared. That explained the lack of visible identity. But the mystery of the fingerprints remained unsolved. So I was not satisfied and requested a more thorough autopsy, with specific tests that were normally not done unless there was suspicion of particularities. The autopsy revealed some internal injuries that did not fit with a common accident or a random assault. The pattern of wounds was strange. It indicated someone had wanted to erase not only his name, but very likely his life, his essence. It was as if he had been attacked with the intention of eliminating any chance that someone could identify him. But how do you erase fingerprints? And why would someone do that? That question led me into a world I had only heard rumors about, but had never seen clear evidence of: identity manipulation. I learned about people who, for various reasons, try to disappear, not only physically but legally and digitally. People involved in powerful conflicts, who have enemies for whom it's preferable to be forgotten entirely. It was a perverse game of memory, and oblivion pushed the limit. But that wasn't enough. I couldn't stay with that idea. I had to know what was behind that silent man. Fortunately, one night while closely examining some details of the chest cavity message, I found an almost erased tattoo hidden in a corner of the chest. It was a small symbol, hard to distinguish, but I captured it with the help of a digital image microscope. It took me hours to compare it with databases of clandestine groups, secret associations, and when a match finally appeared, I felt my skin crawl. It was a mark of an organization many believed had dissolved years ago, but that was still operating in the city's shadows. The man had been part of that network. And then everything fit. They had wanted to erase him, erase his trace, because he knew too much. He had information that could topple entire structures, secrets some preferred to bury forever. The cleansing was not just physical or digital. It was an attempt to silence the truth, to condemn a man to absolute oblivion. I felt a mix of indignation and responsibility. This stranger could not continue to be missing, neither on paper nor in collective memory. I began to connect the pieces, to follow threads that led me to other similar disappearances, forced silences, and hidden messages in small details that only someone who lives day by day searching for truth can decipher. Some days I let frustration weigh on me. Other nights I felt closer than ever to understanding the real picture. But everything I learned told me we were facing something beyond ordinary cases, touching the very nature of identity and memory in the modern age. One early morning, while reviewing dark files on a police server, a name associated with that tattoo appeared. Fragmentary but real. It was not an ordinary name, but a lost file from official records, as if all traces of that person had been systematically erased from history. I couldn't believe it. The humiliation and power to erase someone made real before my eyes, a battle between existence and oblivion. That's when I understood how important our traces, our marks, are, not only for justice, but for our own humanity. I returned to the lab with new but disturbing information. I reported it to my superiors, aware that what I was uncovering put at risk those who wanted that truth buried. Suddenly, I felt watched, not only by the usual insecurity of the job, but by a different sense of danger. That story was not just a forensic medical case. It was an undercover battle for memory, between dead men who don't want to be remembered and living ones determined to give them a voice. I was caught in the middle, with the almost impossible task of restoring an erased man's identity. With each passing day, I realized my role was not just technical, not just medical. It was to be detective, confidant, perhaps even guardian of secrets. I began seeking testimonies from neighbors, close relatives, people who might have seen but had not spoken. No one knew anything, or no one wanted to say. But a clue came unexpectedly when a friend of the victim decided to tell me, almost in whispers, that for months he had been receiving threats, that something dark surrounded this case long before that body was found. That confession opened a door I hadn't expected. It was not just a missing man, but someone who had been silenced from within, a victim of machinery that does not only eliminate people but ideas, words, entire memories. I had to be patient, move cautiously, seek discreet allies within the system, because I knew each discovery could be a bomb for powerful structures, and I was facing a story that would change how we understand identity and justice. And there I am, writing these lines to you, friend, because this case is not a simple file. It is the story of how the most important trace is not the one you leave on the skin, but the one you leave in memory, in conscience. That man who seemed a stranger already has a name for me, and soon he will have one for many more. Because truth cannot be erased, not if someone is willing to seek it, to rescue from oblivion, to give it back to the world. And although I don't know what will happen next with this story, nor what doors I will open or close by telling it, I know that this trace that did not exist taught me that identity transcends the physical, and that sometimes the greatest battle we face is to be remembered when everything and everyone wants us to disappear. That is the deepest lesson I take with me. There is no absolute oblivion. There is always a crack of truth waiting to be discovered. And that crack has been my path, my struggle, and now, my story for you. What came next was an almost impenetrable labyrinth, a web of silences and shadows intertwined with every small step I managed to take. I couldn't have imagined that that body without traces would become the key to opening a door that had been sealed for a long time, a door that not even the institutions meant to protect us wanted to be opened. The pressure grew, but curiosity and the need for justice drove me not to stop. I began to meticulously review the medical reports, searching for any detail we might have missed initially. There was something in those internal wounds that didn't fit common patterns, something almost ritualistic, as if the violence that ended his life were some kind of message. But the message was coded, hidden in those injuries, and I had to find out what it said. I requested advanced toxicological analyses, tissue studies to detect uncommon substances, even traces of chemicals that might have been used to alter something in his body beyond the visible physical damage. While waiting for the results, I continued searching black databases and archives of unsolved cases, selecting names that could be linked to that almost imperceptible tattoo. Then, something happened that completely changed the course. I received an anonymous call, a broken voice, barely a whisper warning me to stop pursuing the case. I felt a chill down my spine. The voice was close, too familiar to be a mere stranger, as if someone who knew the case on the inside was telling me I was playing with fire. But far from stopping, those words ignited in me a determination that became almost obsessive. Who wanted to silence that body even after death? What secret was hidden behind that systematic elimination? Cautiously, I expanded the circle of informants. I revisited the neighborhoods where he was supposedly living, walked the streets frequented by that nameless man. No matter how much I asked, no one seemed to recognize him. But little by little, I began to find small cracks in that wall of indifference. A street vendor remembered seeing him once, talking to someone who seemed important. A taxi driver mentioned dropping him off at an address I verified was near a series of abandoned warehouses known for illicit activities. Each clue was a thin thread. But with enough patience and strategy, I began to weave a net that pointed to a much broader and more dangerous story than that of a simple traceless corpse. I came across the possibility that that secret network, the group marked by that tattoo, was being used not only for criminal activities but to manipulate information, people, and even the judicial system. Many members disappeared without a trace, and those who tried to speak ended up silenced or erased from official databases, just like that man with the tattoo invisible to the system. The idea spun in my head. It was a machine designed not only to eliminate physical evidence, but also the very memory of those who had been there. It was a chilling reality that challenged not only justice but social memory, that fabric that sustains truth and coexistence. The deeper I went into that investigation, the clearer it became that I would face resistance, not only from those who had erased the traceless man, but also from those involved, directly or indirectly, in that dark network. The threats I had already received became more frequent. Encrypted messages and anonymous emails, photos of my movements, shadows that seemed to follow me. Paranoia settled into my routine, but I couldn't turn back. Not after knowing what I knew. Not after finding those pieces of history hidden in a corpse that seemed like a ghost. One night, while reviewing documents in a cafe with a secure connection, I received an email containing a video. It was brief, just a few seconds, but revealing. It showed a person I recognized from an archive photo. One of the leaders of that organization believed to have disintegrated, now much more alive than anyone could imagine. In the video, that person spoke with another figure. Their words were ambiguous, but the tone conveyed a clear message. who must continue to disappear, who must remain forgotten. I knew that message was also directed at me, a sign to stop digging. But for me, it was a definitive confirmation. This was not an isolated case nor an accident. It was a silent war of which I was an involuntary protagonist. I put everything into perspective. The trace that didn't exist was more than an absence in system. It was a symbol of the struggle between remembering and forgetting, between truth and institutionalized lies. I understood that it wouldn't be enough to just document that body, not even to assign a name to the files. It was necessary to tell the whole story, resist the imposed silence, bring to light those identities that power wanted buried. I felt I was facing commitment that transcended my work as a forensic doctor. It was a moral and social responsibility. Then I remembered the friend who had confided his fears to me. One early morning, after several weeks of discreet surveillance, I managed to find him in a hideout. The conversation was brief, filled with fear and hope. He gave me documents that confirmed the existence of a massive identity manipulation network, where not only people were erased, but also their stories and testimonies. He told me about fabricated alibis, disappearing evidence, corrupted official files. He explained that traceless man was only the tip of the iceberg, one more sacrifice in a macabre game to control collective memory. His words echoed in my head like a call not to give up. Every new piece of information made me more aware of the danger, but also more certain that the only way to honor that man's memory was to keep his story alive. That's why I decided to document everything. Create a hidden folder with encrypted backup copies, reliable contacts outside the country, small trusted circles with journalists and activists who could help me break the silence. I knew that network never slept, that it could react at any moment, but that act of silent rebellion was my way of giving that man back the identity that was taken from him. Sometimes I wondered if it was enough, if one person could do anything against such powerful and subtle structures. But I also remembered that every trace, no matter how invisible it seemed, had left a mark. Maybe not in official databases, nor in documents, nor on digital screens, but in shared memories, in human solidarity, in the tireless search for justice. That was the real battle, a fight between imposed oblivion and the will to remember. And I, without realizing it, had become a guardian of those silenced voices. Time passed, and each day brought its own burden of uncertainty and risk. But there were also moments of small victory. When I managed to have someone recognize a name, even clandestinely, when I found a lost record, or when a journalist published a small note questioning the system. Those little cracks in the darkness were light. Signs that truth, no matter how much they wanted to hide it, can never be completely buried. One morning, while reviewing a worn-out report from constant use, something caught my attention strongly. A barely visible, almost forgotten line mentioning a name that had come up in my early investigations. It was a real name, but inserted in a document as if by mistake, or worse, as a maneuver to confuse. That clue, as minimal as it seemed, made me realize I was closer to the truth than I thought. It was as if fate was winking at me, reminding me that no trace, no matter how impossible to find, ceases to exist entirely. Maybe this case seemed like a simple file, one more nameless body in the morgue, but for me, it became something much deeper. In that trace that didn't exist, I discovered that identity is not just a sum of data, nor a certificate, nor even a series of digital marks. It's a story that resists disappearing, a puzzle of memories and voices that someone, somewhere, will always be willing to reconstruct, protect, and remember. That is what turns a name into a person, and a person into an eternal memory. I still don't know how all this will end. I don't know if all the loose ends will ever come together, if that story can be told in full without filters or censorship. But what I do know is that as long as someone is willing to search, to ask, to refuse to accept that a lost trace is the end, there will always be hope. And that hope feeds on the certainty that memory, that human capacity to remember and name, is the most powerful weapon to resist imposed oblivion. So here I am, my friend, sharing with you this story born from a traceless body, from a man they tried to erase from the world, but who now has a voice, a face, a memory. Not because the system allowed it, but because someone decided not to let him go, because someone decided that truth is, above all, invincible. The The trace that didn't exist is now a light, a beacon that illuminates not just a case, but much greater truth, that no one can ever truly be erased, as long as someone is willing to remember. That discovery of the barely perceptible name in that worn-out report made me feel that the story was pulling me with greater force, that the invisible line that seemed to connect scattered fragments of reality was about to reveal something much bigger. But what came next was not a confident step forward, but an abyss where reality and uncertainty intertwined. It was then that I began to notice subtle changes in my surroundings, doors that were once open closed for no apparent reason. Colleagues avoided looking me in the eye, and a growing murmur of warnings disguised as well-intentioned advice. It was as if I myself was becoming a character in that hidden story, a link the system intended to cut to prevent the truth from coming to light. It was a strange and paralyzing sensation. At every step, I felt someone watching me, that my movements were being monitored with an attention bordering on obsession. At times, the phone vibrated with calls from unknown numbers, and there were moments when, turning around on the street, I felt that invisible gaze of someone walking too close, lingering in the shadows with the intent to intimidate. However, far from stopping me, the stalking awoke in me a disturbing mixture of fear and focus, a certainty that if I gave in all the effort, all the struggle, would be lost forever. Taking advantage of that tension, I decided to delve even deeper into the confidential files I had managed to recover, searching for patterns not evident at first glance. I began organizing every name, every document, every small piece of evidence about those who had disappeared without a trace, people who, like my man without fingerprints, had been erased not only from physical reality, but also from documentary memory. It was in that process that I discovered a disturbing coincidence. Many of the disappearances, erasures, and silences were tied to a period of political transition, when several institutions were being restructured and certain files began to dissolve under layers of bureaucracy and intentional negligence. I realized then that the case I was working on was much more than a forensic anomaly or an administrative error. It was a window into a deep network of corruption, complicity, and institutional manipulation. But hope, though faint, had not disappeared. I began abruptly but cautiously sharing some leads with journalists I could trust, someone accustomed to navigating delicate information and reading between the lines, possessing the intuition necessary not to fall into provocations or traps. This alliance was a critical point because, together, we could combine my technical knowledge with her ability to reach the public and sources inaccessible to me. However, the reaction was swift and dangerous. In less than a week, the journalists received covert threats. Computers were hacked, intimidating messages not only aiming to stop the investigation, but to sow fear among those daring to look behind the veil. It became clear then that in that dark network no one was willing to give in, that silence had real enemies determined to maintain it at any cost. At the same time, this opened another door, the understanding that the strength of that system of erasure and manipulation did not rest solely on brute power, but on the collective fear generated by the knowledge that missing trace could mean total disappearance. This fear was the most effective tool to perpetuate their system, and my challenge began to be not only to seek the truth, but to strengthen the will of those who, like me, decided to fight against that imposed oblivion. Meanwhile, the search led me to contact cryptography and database experts abroad, who began helping unravel possible manipulations in official systems. They were people who offered discretion and anonymity, but also knew knowledge, how information, documents, photographs, and digital records could be sophisticatedly tampered with to hide identities, change dates, fabricate stories that remain intact on the surface, while the background was a carefully woven lie. Thus, each case was a puzzle, and every false piece was a trap into which I could fall if I trusted appearances too much. The tension grew exponentially. On one occasion, a late-night work session I held with one of these specialists ended abruptly when, without hearing footsteps or any sign, the computer holding all the information began showing strange failures. Files disappeared, and the internet connection was cut off. At first, I thought it was a common virus, but the way I had been compromised indicated someone had access to much more than a simple local network. It was a calculated operation to erase any trace of the file and my work. It was not just a blow to the investigation. It was a direct warning to me. If I kept going, I might be the one to disappear from reality. Amid that storm, one night, I received another anonymous message. This time not by phone or email, but an envelope slid under the door of my office. It contained a handful of photographs, blurry images taken from afar, showing people dressed casually, gathering in a dark and poorly lit place, in front of what appeared to be security cameras. Among them, I recognized two figures who appeared in official documents as deceased years before, people whom the state claimed no longer existed, but who were alive and active in that secret network. That pictorial document was a chilling confirmation. Those controlling that web had the capacity to falsify the history of their members, to create fictitious disappearances, to continue their plans without raising suspicion. The story then took on an even more complex shade because I realized it was not only a mechanism to manipulate files or erase identities, but a structure capable of rehabilitating and reinserting them when convenient. Elements like on a chessboard, where each piece moves strategically to maintain total control. With that knowledge, the case ceased to be a simple file in a Mexico City morgue. It turned into a dangerous game of shadows where reality, lies, memory, and oblivion mixed on shifting ground. It was in those days that a part of me fought against doubt and exhaustion. I wondered if it was worth it, and what would happen if I lost everything. My career, my safety, my life. But the memory of the man without fingerprints, that intangible presence that had come to my hands and then disappeared from the system, became a beacon in the darkness. Every time the weight felt unbearable, that unknown figure reminded me that behind every anonymity there was a story, a life worth telling, a truth that had to be brought to light, so the world would not forget it. So, armed with an uncomfortable mix of fear and challenge, I decided to prepare a secret presentation where I gathered everything I had accumulated: evidence, encrypted testimonies, fragmented official files, and recovered documents revealing the scale of the erasure and manipulation operation. I did it with the intention of showing it to a small, select group of idealistic people willing to defend the truth despite the risks. It was a risky bet because I knew I couldn't trust too many people, but it was also the only way for it not to remain on my desk, locked in the shadow of fear. That meeting took place in a guarded location, away from cameras and unwanted ears. There, I could feel the energy of a group that, although aware of the danger, was determined to break the silence. The discussions were intense, cautious, and careful. There was distrust, but also complicity. And it was in that moment, looking at those committed faces, that I understood that the fight against the forced disappearance of identities was not something that could be fought with legal or technical evidence alone. It was a cultural and social battle, a fight for the right to be remembered, to exist fully. After that meeting, the pressure increased even more. My personal phone was tapped, some resources mysteriously vanished, and one morning I found a note stuck to my front door. 2 words written in red ink that said, "Stop now." That warning was as clear as a gunshot, but it caused an unexpected reaction in me. A deep, determined calm, the kind of serenity that comes when you know you're on the right path, and giving up is not an option. I knew that the network I had uncovered didn't only want to silence the man without fingerprints, but anyone who tried to restore his story. Since then, every step has become both more dangerous and more necessary. The battle is neither simple nor swift. But I have also learned that in these kinds of struggles, every spoken word, every recovered file, every reactivated memory carries immeasurable weight. Those small victories, like helping a family reclaim a piece of their history or having an activist publicly denounce corruption, become open wounds in the system, cracks through which light can begin to seep in. One might think that a body without fingerprints is merely a forensic medical mystery, a riddle to solve to bring some peace to a wandering soul. But for me, and for those who have heard this story, it became a symbol, a powerful reminder that identity transcends papers, databases, or official records. Identity resides in collective memory, in the solidarity among those unwilling to let anyone disappear without a trace, and in the conviction of those who believe that remembering is an act of resistance. I don't know what path this case will take, nor if it will ever become fully visible to the public eye or recognized by the authorities. But I know, with a certainty that only experience gives, that as long as there is someone willing to search, to question, to challenge silence, the trace that did not exist will continue to exist, latent and alive, like an invisible testimony that can never be completely erased. And if you allow me, friend, that is the last message I want to leave today. That in a world where disappearances multiply not only in bodies but in memories and files, no one is invisible if someone remembers. That memory, that human capacity to name and honor, is the greatest strength to resist darkness. And that every step we take in the search for truth, no matter how slow, dangerous, or uncertain, builds that invincible chain that links the past with the present and prevents history from fading into oblivion. Because in the end, to the man without fingerprints, I did not only return identity. I gave him eternity, made of voices, names, and memories. And that, my friend, is something no amount of sophisticated manipulation will ever erase. The feeling of being trapped in a scheme that overwhelmed me, but from which I couldn't and didn't want to escape, grew more intense day by day. The threats never ceased, contacts became scarcer, and paranoia turned into an almost constant companion. But the heaviest burden was not the fear of silence or oblivion. It was a painful certainty that behind that imposed void, behind the disappearance of the man without footprints and so many others like him, there lurked a much deeper harm. The fracture of truth itself, the contamination of shared history, the destruction of the foundations by which we recognize ourselves as society. And that open wound, invisible to many, was the one I had set out to heal, even if it meant walking on the edge of a precipice. One of those long nights, as I reviewed thousands of data once again, I began to notice a pattern, not only in the physical disappearances or altered documents, but in the small cracks that the network itself was beginning to show. Some of the manipulated files had contradictory details, senseless duplicated records, overlapping dates that denied each other. These errors were so subtle they seemed almost insignificant at first, but they began to act as smoke signals. Signs that someone or something within that corrupt structure was starting to lose control, or at least to make mistakes. Those details became the most important key, the door that could bring down a wall built with years of concealments. But I also knew that thinking this way meant taking an even greater risk. Interpreting that data was not simple. It required combining my forensic experience with advanced digital tools that my cryptographer allies helped me employ. We worked quietly, almost always in the shadows of night, analyzing code, reconstructing databases, cross-referencing dates and names with external information that we carefully obtained. While to anyone else, it would seem only technical work. For me, it meant reconstructing fragments of life, of memory, in every piece of retrieved data, in every detected and corrected error. I felt that the man without footprints and those others previously erased were gradually beginning to regain meaning. But dodging danger became more complicated. The system I had uncovered not only had technological resources, it had a ruthless human apparatus to protect itself. One day, in a cafe where I met a contact to exchange information, I suddenly realized someone was following me. The behavior was so clumsy, so obvious, that it seemed like a bad movie act, but precisely for that reason, it triggered all my alarms. This guy, a stocky and silent man, kept his distance, and although I tried to lose him through labyrinthine streets, it was impossible. It was the first time I understood that they were not only interested in silencing my findings, but that my own safety was truly at stake. That made me reconsider my measures. I began changing routines, using even more secure encrypted communications, trusting less in everyday noise not to give clues. And despite everything, the investigation advanced, because what I had discovered was too big to let it die locked in a bureaucratic freezer. Then came an unexpected twist, an internal leak. An anonymous official within one of the state bodies sent me a package with documents proving direct links between high-ranking officials and the network of identity falsification and disappearance. There were names, dates, signed orders, and even email exchanges. This revelation not only confirmed the scheme I suspected, but elevated it to a political and social level that could shake fundamental pillars. However, that internal tip brought immediate consequences. Surveillance over me intensified, and with it, the threats began to target those supporting me directly. The journalist I worked with had to leave the country temporarily, and my closest collaborators had to hide or change identities for a while. The abyss I had faced became so real that, for several weeks, I even considered giving it all up. But then the image of the man without footprints came to mind, that absence representing a whole network of injustices and forgetfulness, and I couldn't shake off the idea that surrendering meant allowing that absence to become a bottomless pit from which no one could ever be rescued. It was then that I decided I had to reveal what I possessed, even if it was little, fragmented. In an act of faith, against all odds, I organized a small clandestine conference, only for those people I could verify as trustworthy. They chose to be independent journalists, activists, academics, some lawyers, but all with a shared conviction: the need for the truth not to die in the governing silence. There, in that hidden room, I detailed the complex network of manipulation, fictitious disappearances to cover corruption, the systematic alteration of files, relentless surveillance of those who dare to ask, and the hope that defied fear. It was a moment both emotional and terrifying, because in that room I was not merely showing data, but challenging a system built on oblivion. After that presentation, the reaction was swift. Threats, now formal and blatant, came from every direction. Habeas corpus blocked, censorship orders, requests to arrest me on unfounded charges. My environment became a minefield of uncertainty. But surprisingly, there was also an unexpected response. Groups of citizens began to organize, to demonstrate peacefully, demanding transparency and justice. Social media lit up with the story of the man without footprints and the tale of those erased identities. And although the attacks were relentless, the light of resistance began to break through. There, I understood something vital: truth, however silent it may have been for years, once freed, has the power to summon and unite, something no dark conspiracy can stop forever. Amid that chaos and unprecedented wave, I received definitive information, one last clue. After months of searching, I discovered the physical place where, according to some key testimonies, the original and secret archives were stored, those not totally destroyed or altered. It was not a public archive nor a data center, but a basement hidden in an abandoned government building, protected by security systems and apparently no longer in use. The possibility of accessing that site meant taking a decisive leap to prove the truth, to tangibly recover the evidence that could break the wall of silence. But it also meant exposing oneself to extreme risk, almost a suicide mission. The day I decided to enter that clandestine archive, I went alone, aware that I could not involve anyone else in such a delicate and dangerous operation. I worked swiftly and meticulously, gathering boxes, papers, hard drives, trying to escape unnoticed. It was an experience marked by adrenaline, by constant fear of being caught, but also by the deep hope that there, among those documents, lay the key to closing the circle. Before my eyes, I could touch victims' testimonies, files on forced disappearances, records showing identity restorations and mass digital manipulations, but also lists of names that should never have been lost. With that material in my hands, the dimension of the corrupt network became even more tangible. The documents revealed how certain groups within power had decided who could exist and who could disappear, manipulating the system not only to erase names, but to maintain a facade of legality and order. It was absolute control, perpetrated with sophistication and brutality, leaving thousands of people without the possibility to claim their basic rights. And yet, that collection of papers and data was also irrefutable proof that truth could emerge, that collective memory could be rebuilt if someone dared to keep the flame alive. I left that place mixed with exhaustion and determination, convinced that those documents could not lie hidden on my desk. They had to be shared, disseminated, known. It was a crucial moment because it implied not only facing personal danger, but also risking everything for the cause of returning identity to those who had been torn from the world. That is why I approached those activists and organizations who had long supported the fight against forced disappearance. And together we designed a plan to protect the information and turn it into a tool for social demand. Today, looking back, I see that every step of this path was marked by tension, uncertainty, and also by the courage of those who, despite everything, chose not to remain silent. My personal story is now intertwined with that of a man, without footprints, and thousands more who wait for the world to recognize them. When I tell you this, my friend, I do not do it just to open a window to fear or conspiracy, but so you understand that behind any absence, there is a presence that asks to be heard. Sometimes, the most invisible can be the most powerful, and the footprints that do not exist in databases may be engraved in the collective conscience, just waiting for someone to rescue them. Because the struggle that began in a morgue, among nameless and passless bodies, is now a call to active memory. It is not only about documents or investigations. It is about dignity, justice, and humanity. Likewise, every word spoken, every testimony preserved, becomes a firm resistance against imposed oblivion. The footprint that didn't exist, the one that seemed like a definitive loss, remains there, alive, insistent. Because as long as someone remembers, that footprint becomes a symbol that not everything is said, that no story ends while someone is willing to look beyond the wall. And with that conviction, I say goodbye, not as a mere kind of forensic case, but with a certainty that our greatest weapon against disappearance arises when we decide to name, think, and remember. The man without footprints is no longer lost. His identity was not only recovered, but transformed into a beacon for those who, like me and many others, continue to believe that truth always has the last word. Because even in the absolute silence where it seemed nothing existed, there's always a hidden footprint waiting for the right moment to reappear and change everything. From that moment on, the feeling of standing on the edge of an abyss grew stronger and stronger. The file I had recovered was not just a pile of papers and hard drives, but the living evidence of a system rotten to the core, fed by the invisibility of those who could not defend themselves, by identities torn away with the brutality of a blur made with brushstrokes as firm as they were silent. Every name on that list, every open file, was a mute scream that was now beginning to find a body, a face that could no longer be ignored. But it was not just an exercise in memory. It was a dangerous game where any misstep could mean the end. The threats kept coming, and this time they seemed closer, more real. Every move had to be calculated, every word measured. It was no longer just my safety at stake, but that of so many who dared to join this cause. Paranoia, which had initially been an occasional visitor, now settled in as a permanent guest. I felt watched from the shadows, the invisible eyes closing in on me at every corner. It was during one of those days when I decided not to leave the house that it happened. An anonymous, heavy call, with that faceless voice that only knows how to provoke fear. They told me not to go on, that the man without traces was only the first, that stopping me was stopping many more. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. But that warning, far from making me back down, only ignited a fiercer flame in my spirit. I reviewed an old file, a record that until then had gone unnoticed among the tangle of data. There was an unexpected connection, certain files showing disappearances coinciding with states of emergency in different countries in the region, with similar patterns of document manipulation. That network was not just local. It was part of a larger, more organized and systematic web than anyone could imagine. We knew the traces were not only digital or fingerprint-based, but human, social, political. Those who wanted to erase those people also sought to disappear the truth their lives could tell. And we, the guardians of that truth, were the last obstacle between them and total silence. With that certainty, I reconnected with some international allies, cryptographers, and human rights defenders who had experienced similar cases. The synergy allowed the opening of new paths to circumvent computer blockades and virtual threats. I learned that resistance was not only physical but also technological, that every key we deciphered, every protocol we broke, was one more step toward the freedom of a mutilated collective memory. But I also understood that I could not do alone, that strength lay in the union of voices, in multiplying those fragments of truth turned into indestructible testimonies. Meanwhile, official pressure did not wait. There were nights when I heard strange noises around my house, and when I went out, strangers' glances stabbed like knives, seeking to intimidate, dominating with fear. Once, I was nearly detained under false accusations, an episode that was only resolved thanks to the quick intervention of colleagues who believed in the cause. Each of those moments taught me that my enemy was all-powerful and willing to do anything, but also that hope rose amid fear, that those I helped began to emerge in the darkness, strong not only in body but in will. In the secrecy of a new meeting, surrounded by people who were no longer just numbers in a file, but comrades in struggle, we made the most dangerous decision: to bring the information to the public light, to create a secure database, accessible only through encrypted networks, where anyone searching for a disappeared person could find a thread, a clue, a starting point to claim their story. We knew that this action would expose us openly, but also that voluntary silence was no longer an option. Giving up would mean accepting that those erased lives could never be recognized. Preparing that release of information was like sharpening a sword. Every technical detail, every safeguard to protect users, every encrypted message was a step toward a revolutionary act that did not involve weapons or bullets, but data, truths that cut the lie at its root. The inauguration of that database was discreet but strong. Within days, testimonies began to arrive from across the country, from people who found hope in that digital archive, a chance to reconstruct a personal or family history that had been taken from them. It was an unstoppable movement, a tide carrying beneath it thousands of silent stories, and it could neither be stopped nor should it. But just when it seemed the wave of truth had found a channel, the final blow came. A coordinated attack on the digital infrastructure attempted to erase that database, to eliminate the bridge of memory we had built with so much effort. They tried to silence us by all means, from media manipulation to technological sabotage. However, the community formed around the cause reacted with unexpected strength, multiplying virtual embraces, discovering new ways to protect that digital memory. The traces that did not exist seemed now etched with glowing iron in the consciences of thousands, impossible to erase. It was at that moment I understood something crucial. The battle was not only against a corrupt system or network, but against oblivion itself. That invisible enemy that sometimes appears disguised as indifference, apathy, routine. But what we had done was not a fleeting or small act. It was a paradigm shift in the way of continuing to seek and claim identity, dignity, and justice. We had returned the man without traces to a place where he was no longer just another number, but a symbol of resistance, a beacon lighting the path for many others. If you ask me what I learned in this whole process, I would say that truth is never truly lost. They may hide the traces, alter identifications, manipulate documents, or erase records, but they cannot disappear the memory kept in people's hearts, in those small lights that, though flickering in the darkness, remain lit. That identity is much more than a name on paper or a digital record. It is an act of recognition, a social pact so that no one is a forgotten shadow, and that pact, once broken, can be rebuilt with the strength of those who dare to look beyond. I don't know what awaits me in the days ahead. I don't even know if this voice will ever be heard beyond those corners where I now find myself. But I am clear that surrender is not an option. That as long as there is someone willing to name, to remember, to resist, the man without traces and all who, like him, were destined to disappear will remain alive, demanding justice and a place in history. Because in that space where it seemed nothing existed, where there were no traces or data, there's always been a truth waiting patiently, a truth that only asked to be found. So I tell you this with all the certainty I can have. The traces the system wanted to erase were not a void. They were a challenge, an invitation to discover that identity is a collective act, that memory is a flame that does not go out, and that each one of us carries a part of that light. The man without traces is no longer just another disappeared person. His story, fragmented by power and fear, has been reborn in the hands of those who dare to search beyond the wall, in those who listen and those who do not forget. And that, my friend, is a true victory, making silence an impossible last word.